Well, good evening, and welcome to We Make the Way, an online series brought to you by the ACLU of Florida. I'm Micah Kubik, Executive Director of the ACLU of Florida, and I thank you for joining us for tonight's installment, a discussion of what we have to look forward to, or maybe just what we have to be very worked up about and agitated about in the 2021 Florida legislative session. Now, this is the third episode of We Make the Way. We've already hosted a great discussion on how to build power for progress in the South and about the unacceptable horror that is our nation's approach to immigration detention. If you didn't have a chance to catch those two segments, I hope that you'll go back and find them because we had some great panelists who were engaged in vibrant, informative, and inspiring discussion about some of the most pressing civil rights issues of the day. And that's really the goal of We Make the Way, to give you just a taste of the fact that there are folks all over Florida who are building a movement for freedom, for justice, and for democracy. At a time when the values we say we share as Americans are getting a pummeling, especially from Governor Ron DeSantis, we want to focus on what we are all doing together to push back and to defend our values. Now, tonight, we want to spend a little time talking about the upcoming Florida legislative session. Right now, many people are spending a lot of time worrying about what is happening in Washington, D.C. Their attention is focused on the back and forth in Congress about COVID relief, about confirming Joe Biden's cabinet, or about holding Donald Trump and his enablers accountable for the attempted coup. And while it's important for us to focus on all of those items, we shouldn't let it blind us to the hugely important decisions that are about to be made in Florida's state capital, Tallahassee. You see, the state government, the state legislature, the governor, they make all sorts of decisions that have an immediate and outsized impact on our everyday lives. If you doubt the power that state government has on everyday life, just sit back and watch the way Florida's state government has responded to the COVID pandemic. Incoherence, ineffectiveness, inefficiency, ineptitude, insensitivity, intransigence, they've all been on full display in Governor DeSantis' response, and that's made a real difference in real people's lives. But Governor DeSantis doesn't make the laws for the state all by himself. Instead, Florida has three branches of government, and the legislature writes the laws. And on March 2nd, our elected leaders are going to descend on Tallahassee for this year's legislative session. The ACLU and our many partners and allies in the movement for freedom are expecting to see the full range of civil rights and civil liberties under discussion this year. And so tonight on We Make the Way, we want to talk about what we expect to see in the legislature. What are the bills we're most excited about, most concerned about, most outraged by? What are the threats to freedom and justice? Will Tallahassee continue to be a place where good ideas go to die and bad ideas go to thrive? So, to shed some light on a legislature that is frequently shrouded in darkness and secrecy, we have a really great panel with us this evening. We have three people who know the Florida legislature, the politics and policy of it, better than any human being really ought to. And so we're pleased to have Pamela Birch-Fort, Kurt Bailey, and Kara Gross with us this evening. I'm going to ask them to go around and introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with you, Pamela. Pamela Birch-Fort, president of the Commerce Group. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Micah, and thank you for that great introduction to what our legislative session is really all about. I am Pamela Birch-Fort. I am a consultant to ACLU of Florida. My background is I spent 16 years working in the Florida Senate, 12 of those years as staff director of a major committee, and I've been in private practice, basically a government private practice since that time. And I am about to enter my 42nd consecutive legislative session. It just amazes me that I have decided to stay around that long. But I obviously enjoy what I do, and I certainly have enjoyed my time working with ACLU of Florida.
Thank you, Pamela. I don't believe it. 42 years, I don't believe it for a minute, and you are a brave, brave woman. Uh, Kirk Bailey, I'll go to you next. Kirk is the political director at the ACLU of Florida, a role he's been in since, I think, 2016. Kirk, tell us a little more about yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Micah, and thank you for the introduction. I agree, it can't possibly have been 42 years for Pamela. I have been at the ACLU of Florida for 4 years, since 2016. Came here after a long career in public advocacy and lobbying, both in our nation's capital, as well as here in Florida and in other states. Excited to be able to talk to everybody about this upcoming legislative session. Back to you.
Thank you, Kirk. And finally, we'll go to Kara Gross, who serves as the legislative director for the ACLU of Florida. She is our person in the Capitol there for every single skirmish in the struggle. Kara, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Micah. Yes, hi, everybody. I'm Kara Gross. I'm the Legislative Director and Senior Policy Counsel for the ACLU of Florida, and I am based in Tallahassee, Florida's capital, and I manage our legislative program and our priorities, which include criminal justice, immigrants' rights, voting rights, reproductive justice, LGBTQ rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Kara. Pamela, Kirk, Kara, thank you again for joining us this evening. And thank you for those of you who are watching. We want to encourage you to submit questions for the panel. You can do that in the comments section, and we'll get to a few of them at least at the end of our discussion. But first, I want to start the conversation by asking you, Pamela, to give us just a little background on the legislative session. It starts on March 2nd, but how long does it last? What do the legislators have to do over the next couple of weeks? And is it really true that the legislature only works for these few months of the year?
Thank you, Micah. And again, I want to also welcome all of those who have joined us this evening to discuss our legislative process and legislative advocacy for the 2021 legislative session. As you stated, Micah, the work of the legislative branch of government affects all of us because the legislature makes laws that govern most of what we do every single day. Because it affects our lives in so many ways, it's vitally important that lawmakers understand how these laws impact us, our families, and the communities that we live in. Now, the Florida Constitution defines the Florida legislature, which is comprised of the House of Representatives and the Senate, as a part-time legislature. Some states have legislatures that meet for longer periods of time, some all year. In Florida, our regular legislative session convenes once a year for 60 consecutive days. So this year, the 2021 legislative session begins on Tuesday, March 2nd, and it ends on Friday, April 30th. Bills are considered and voted on by various committees during the regular legislative session. They are voted on by the full body and then forwarded on to the governor for signing into law, or every now and then for a veto. Florida also provides for a series of interim committee meetings that allow file bills to be considered and voted on during an interim or pre-session period. So bills actually begin moving through the legislative system before the actual start of the regular session. So beginning in January of this year, the House and Senate committees began meeting to hear bills, receive citizen input, and to vote on those bills. This evening, you're going to find out about a few of those bills. Some of them are already moving through the system. And we're going to talk to you a bit about what they can do to impact your life and what you can do to advocate around these measures, even in this pandemic environment. I anticipate the legislative session to be a bit gloomy this year because of the pandemic. So many lives and so many industries have been affected in negative ways. As we look at the building of the budget which is done during the legislative session, we're not going to see a lot of new revenues to improve Medicaid and access to health services, to assist our juveniles and our students in schools and colleges. So it's going to be a bit tough. On top of that, it's going to be a bit of an angry bird session. We have a lot of legislation out there that really won't serve our citizens well, won't put us in the best position to move forward and to enhance our lives. But please know and be assured that ACLU is on the ground in Tallahassee. We are working diligently to protect and defend your civil liberties and your civil rights. Thank you, Micah.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for that great introduction to the process. I want to stay with you for just another minute here. Every legislative session, it tends to have a theme, an overarching narrative, a set of priorities. Sometimes that theme is set by the leadership on purpose. Sometimes it's set by people outside of the legislature who notice what they're up to. It's still early days, but what do you think the theme of this legislative session is shaping up to be?
We are still hunting for that theme. We haven't found a lot of symmetry between the leadership of the House and the Senate in terms of structuring a collective forward movement of certain bills to try to get Florida on a better track. We seem to be following the edict of the governor. He has several bills that he's been talking about since early fall. And whether those bills prove to be positive or negative for our citizens, our legislature seems to be following along with that. And that will cause us some concern and has certainly attracted our attention and our efforts this year. So again, it's going to be a bit angry and a bit gloomy and sort of all over the spectrum.
Thank you. I like the word asymmetry. So angry asymmetry as the theme for the session might be a good one.
There you go.
So as we already mentioned, the session is looking like it's going to have a boatload of bills that are deeply troubling to anyone who cares about freedom and democracy. And so we want to talk about a few of them that the ACLU is following closely. The granddaddy of the deeply disturbing bills is one that the governor, Ron DeSantis, himself wrote and introduced. It's a horrific moral abomination of a bill that, shocking as it is to say out loud, effectively makes peaceful protest a crime. It criminalizes speaking out. Kara Gross, am I exaggerating what this bill does? And can you tell us more about it?
No, Micah, you are absolutely not exaggerating it. It is a horrible, dangerous bill on so many levels. We are, the ACLU of Florida and numerous partner organizations have been heavily engaged in efforts to oppose the governor's dangerous anti-peaceful protest bill. The bill numbers, just so everybody has them, is Senate Bill 484 by Senator Burgess and HB 1 by Representative Fernandez-Barquin. And as Micah said, this was the governor's number one, this was and is the governor's number one priority, is passing this anti-peaceful protest bill. This 50-page bill threatens our First Amendment rights to free speech and assembly. The language of this bill is so broad that under this bill, peaceful protesters could be arrested and prosecuted for a felony conviction and up to 5 years in prison and loss of voting rights, even if they didn't engage in any violent or disorderly conduct. And that is what is so important about this, is that it wraps up everybody who is just peacefully exercising their First Amendment rights. The governor has proposed this bill in direct response to the protests last summer in the aftermath of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others at the hands of police. But we all know that the vast majority of those protests in Florida were peaceful. And instead of addressing the underlying concerns of racial injustice, he instead proposed this bill And he proposed this bill as a direct attempt to silence the dissent. There are so many things wrong with this bill. It's hard to really know where to start, but I'm going to pick up on a couple of things here that are really important for everybody to know about. As I mentioned, this bill is intended to silence dissent and punish protesters who are seeking racial justice. That is the genesis of this bill. It is completely unnecessary. Florida criminal statutes already criminalize violence. They already criminalize destruction of property. We have all the laws on the books we need to keep the public safe. So any kind of indication that this is about combating public disorder is not rooted in the facts of our current criminal justice system, because we have those tools. Law enforcement has those tools already, and they already arrest people who are bad actors and who engage in violence. So we don't need this bill. Additionally, it is contrary to all of the criminal justice reform efforts that we have been pushing in Florida and nationally in order to safely reduce the prison population. This bill will just lead to more Black and brown people being locked up in prison for longer sentences. That's what this bill does. And it makes us spend more of our state's taxpayer dollars on our Department of Corrections and our prison budget. Moreover, this bill actually protects Confederate monuments. It literally, under this bill, the language is so broad that if you are to pull down a Confederate flag, you could get a second-degree felony for up to 15 years in prison. And like I said before, we already have laws on the books that criminalize property destruction. So we don't need something that elevates the protection of Confederate monuments. It also prohibits bail until first appearance. So anybody who is arrested peacefully protesting and is arrested, they will have to spend the night or nights in jail until they can first appear before a judge. It also prevents municipalities from setting their own policing budgets and prioritizing the public safety needs of their community. And it waives sovereign immunity by allowing local governments to be sued for any amount of damages if somebody is injured at a protest. Lastly, and maybe most disturbingly, it's hard to say what's most disturbing about it, but it increases violence against peaceful protesters. The bill actually allows counter-protesters to escape civil liability for killing or injuring a peaceful protester. So you are not wrong, Micah. This bill is horrible on so many levels, and that's why there is so much widespread opposition to it. From State Attorney Warren to the former Supreme Court Justice Quince, the League of Women Voters, to the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, the Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Florida Council of Churches, and pretty much every organization across the spectrum has been opposed to this bill. And it seems like the only person who is interested in this bill is the governor himself. So we encourage everybody to oppose this dangerous bill.
Thanks, Kara. That's a lot of bad things all packed into one bill. It's kind of amazing they managed to fit it all in 50 pages. I mean, that's a lot. So, but Governor DeSantis is really on a roll when it comes to introducing dangerous and destructive bills. And so I want to ask about another one. At a time when democracy itself has come under attack, and plenty of folks have been trafficking in bald-faced lies about our elections, the governor decided to enter the fray himself last week. And he did that despite the fact that the 2020 election, including here in Florida, was the most secure and inclusive election in American history. But last week, Governor DeSantis called for the legislature to change our voting laws in a few ways. So Kirk Bailey, tell us, what did the governor propose and what effect would his proposal have?
Yeah, thank you, Micah. You really hit the nail on the head that the governor is proceeding with yet another effort to, suppress the vote and to stand in the way of citizens expressing their opinions on issues. As you mentioned last week, he did propose legislation that's not yet introduced, but we expect will be shortly, that would limit citizens' rights to vote and how they go about doing that. And what was interesting about it is that he claimed in his own speech, in his in his rally-like announcement of this particular legislation that Florida held, quote, the most transparent and efficient election anywhere in the country. And yet at the same time, he's saying that our system needs reform, that there are things that are wrong with it, that somehow it is prone to fraud and inefficiency that needs to be improved. And so I just want to highlight a couple of things that I think are the most problematic. First, he proposed addressing ballot collection the way that ballots are collected so that no person may possess ballots other than their own or an immediate family members. Now, obviously, in the context of a pandemic, what we saw in 2020 was that some individuals who were at risk of exposure to COVID-19 would ask family members or other representatives to return their ballots, which they're allowed to do under Florida law. And what this provision is really doing is the governor's undercutting citizens' ability to submit their ballots in this way. Another provision in the proposal would prohibit mass mailing of vote-by-mail ballots. Only voters who can request a ballot would receive a ballot. The problem is that Florida election officials don't do this. They don't mass mail ballots. They send them to people who have requested them. But even if they did universal vote by mail, every eligible individual to vote in Florida should be receiving a vote by mail ballot. That would be good public policy and would increase participation in our electoral system. And then finally, I guess I want to emphasize one other provision, which is that they would change the law to allow that vote by mail requests must be made each election year. Right now, when you request a vote by mail ballot, you are requesting it for the upcoming 2 cycles, or essentially 4 years. But this would make you renew it each year, which will undoubtedly mean that fewer folks will request their vote by mail ballots. And the supervisors of elections, the local election officials who are responsible for running our elections, have already said that this will cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars and is cost prohibitive. So really, this bill is just an attempt to propose a solution in search of a problem to limit our access to the ballot. It's part of a nationwide trend. There are 253 bills similar to this in 43 different states that restrict voting access. And we will obviously be opposing it along with all of our voting rights partners every step of the way. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Kirk. You know, it wasn't too long ago that we all agreed that it was actually good when people voted. So it is really a shame that we've come so far so quickly. Now, as a reminder, if you're watching and have a question for the panel, please send it to us in the comments, and we'll get to at least a few of those at the end of our time together. In the meantime, though, there's another area where legislators look like they may at least try to trample on the law and the Constitution, and that's in the area of reproductive freedom. Kara, I've heard that there's a bill that would outright ban abortion procedures at a certain point in the calendar. What can you tell us about that one?
Yeah, thank you, Micah. So once again, yes, we are seeing attacks on our constitutional right to safe and legal abortion. There is several bills, but the one that I'm talking about this evening is this 20-week ban on abortion. It's HB 351 by Representative Gregory and SB 744 by Senator Rodriguez. And these bills are nothing more than cruel attempts to thwart access to safe and legal abortion. We all know that abortion decisions should be made by the pregnant individual and their doctor, not by politicians in Tallahassee trying to score cheap political points. Every Floridian should be able to make their own personal, private healthcare decisions without politicians standing in their way, and that's exactly what this bill is about. So we urge everybody to oppose these bills and to contact your legislators and make sure that they do not have a hearing and that they do not move through this legislative session. Thank you.
Thanks, Kara. Thank you. So now I want to shift gears just a little bit. You've all shared some pretty bracing, some remarkably bad changes that are being considered in Tallahassee. But the story isn't uniformly one of assaults on civil liberties or of indifference to the challenges facing Florida. There are also some good bills being introduced Some of them have better prospects for passing than others, but there are some good bills that are being considered, and I'd like to spend a little time talking about those. Kirk, I want to ask you about police accountability. So clearly over the last 9 months or so, the movement for police accountability, for acknowledgement of the fact that Black Lives Matter has gained momentum, has gained traction. Folks have been fighting to reimagine policing for a long, long time. But after the crimes committed against George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and too many others, it appears that there's new urgency to do something about it. How has the Florida legislature reacted to that urgency? And are there any bills in the wings that would hold police accountable or allow for police divestment?
Yes, thank you, Micah. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to this critically important topic. In fact, there are a whole host of bills that have been proposed that would address various aspects of police accountability and the issues that we saw highlighted so graphically and importantly last summer. So I want to note for everyone that the Florida Black Legislative Caucus introduced a whole package of reforms here in the last couple of weeks as we were conducting the committee hearing weeks. I want to emphasize a couple of those. There are bills that would establish a uniform law enforcement agency standards, Senate Bill 942 and House Bill 647 that we're tracking. There is legislation relating to reforming qualified immunity. That's Senate Bill 670 and House Bill 261. There will be legislation discussed about mandating universal accreditation for law enforcement agencies. That's a House Bill 299. I'm looking through my list here to find some of the most critical ones. There's also one regarding repealing Stand Your Ground, which is House Bill 635. And then I think important related to the use of force and police misconduct is some legislation that's been introduced about creating a registry of misconduct complaints and situations so that we can track officers who are, have a track record of hurting people and do something about them. And that legislation is Senate Bill 480 and House Bill 277. So I would say that I think largely as a result of the impressive advocacy by Black Lives Matter and a whole variety of organizations that have supported that movement, we've seen this legislation develop. I think we're really excited by the prospect that there will be an opportunity for debate around this legislation. But I do think that, as Kara was pointing out earlier, Governor DeSantis's proposal of House Bill 1, the anti-peaceful protest bill, was in direct response to the protests last summer and really is his response and frankly the majority of legislators' response to this issue. And it is simply unacceptable. We must do better when it comes to making our police accountable, making our community safe, and protecting our Black and brown neighbors and friends and family members. Back to you.
Thanks for that, Kirk. Yeah, it's really galling and outrageous that at a time when people are calling for more accountability, the response from the governor and too many legislators is instead for more impunity instead. Now, another area where there's been growing momentum over the last couple of years across the partisan and ideological divide is in the reform of our criminal legal system. In particular, activists around Florida have been calling for reform of our sentencing laws because sentences here are exceptionally harsh. People are imprisoned longer, a greater cost to taxpayers, a greater cost to our communities, and we do very little as a state to try and rehabilitate individuals, to prepare them for life when they return to communities. So, Kara, are legislators going to consider any bills that would address any of those sets of problems?
Thank you, Micah. Yes, for years, we have been working on efforts along with several partner organizations to safely reduce the prison population by increasing rehabilitation credits in prison. It's estimated that the state could save $1 billion by implementing rehabilitation credit reforms in prison. So right now, while our state economy is suffering and the legislators are looking for any means possible to save some money, we have the perfect reform for them because we know that this will exactly do that. We're very excited, particularly about SB 1032, which was introduced this year, which will create incentives for individuals to work hard in prison and to participate in educational and vocational programming to help them become more gainfully employed upon release and to use their time constructively and engage in positive activities. This bill would allow individuals to earn additional time off their sentences for engaging in rehabilitative programming, and it would help to ensure that individuals who have worked hard to turn their lives around would not continue to be unnecessarily warehoused at taxpayer expense. Another bill that is filed that similarly addresses these is HB 235. Thank you, Micah.
Thanks for that, Kara. So I want to remind folks in the audience again that if you have questions for anyone on the panel about anything that's happening in the legislature this year, just go ahead and drop those in the comments, and we'll get to a few of them here in a minute. But next, I want to ask Pamela Birch-Fort, beyond the bills that have already been mentioned tonight, anything else that you really see as something that this legislature is going to prioritize?
Well, Micah, the only bill that the legislature is required to constitutionally pass is the budget. And that is the process that keeps this state moving. Our budget year begins on July and ends on June 30th. So a lot of attention this year will be focused on crafting a budget when we're already in a fiscal deficit. So with that in mind, we're going to see, as I indicated earlier, a lot of industries suffering and a lot of people suffering. The bills that we've mentioned, police reform and criminal justice reform, still all have to be funded in order for those things to take effect. I have noted that there's been a lot of attention to our corrections department this year and the difficulties in staffing. That impacts the lives of inmates, and they have been horribly impacted by COVID-19 because they are in a setting where they have no ability to escape it. So we've seen lots of health concerns there. And when you don't have adequate staffing, it allows for services to not be rendered timely and frustration bills, and we know what can come of that. So again, a lot of the budget activity really impacts so much of our life, and the legislature is really going to have to bear down this year and decide that we're not going to give corporations all of our money and devote it to people. So that's going to be a major focus this year.
Thanks so much. So we're going to move over to questions from the audience here in just a minute, but I want to ask you one last question, Pamela. For a lot of people, Tallahassee seems so far away, not just the physical distance, but worlds away in mindset and the level of connection with the real world problems of Floridians. It just seems very far away. But this is our democracy. It's our state government, so our voices should be heard. What's the most effective way for advocates and activists to do that, especially this year during the pandemic?
Yes, during this COVID environment, it is very difficult to reach our lawmakers on very many levels. Those of us who are accustomed to being in Tallahassee and to be at the Capitol, we have limited access to the Capitol this year. The Senate committees are not allowing the public into committee hearings. In order to provide live testimony, we have to travel about 1.6 miles away from the Capitol building to the Civic Center and provide testimony. In order to enter the House of Representatives, we have to be COVID tested, we have to have an appointment, we have to be escorted through the building, and there is limited seating and testimony at those live committee meetings. So in terms of distancing themselves from the public, there is not a lot of accountability. There is not a lot of transparency this year. So we will have to spend a lot of time doing old school methods of reaching our legislators, in writing letters, in using postcards, in attracting attention in a newspaper and other media through letters to the editor, opinion editorials. We hope to get people on talk radio and midday TV shows and doing old-fashioned telephoning. It's difficult to reach them because many of them are not in their offices due to the pandemic. So if we don't have those private cell numbers and other email addresses, it is difficult to reach them. And it's quite unsettling when the public is vacant from the legislative process because there are no eyes on what's happening. And we all know what happens when there are no eyes on what's happening. So again, the lack of accountability and transparency will probably show up in the horrid legislation that gets passed this year.
Well, it sounds like we have a lot of work to do then, Pamela. So I want to go to some questions from the audience now. We've got quite a few of them. We've got some great ones. And so I want to start with a question about the anti-peaceful protest bill, a question about HB1, which is sort of what's the actual impact on peaceful protesters if this horrible, rotten, no good, terrible, awful bill passes? Kara, what will actually happen to peaceful protesters if this thing passes?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, so for one, peaceful protesters will not want to go to peaceful protests. They will be scared that if they go, they could be arrested, even though they did not engage in any violent or disorderly conduct. And as we spoke about, if they are arrested, they will be required to spend at least the night in jail, but maybe several nights until they go before a court. And they could be charged with a felony and have their voting rights taken away and spend up to 5 years in jail. So a lot of people might choose to not participate. And that's the exact point of this. The point of this is to silence the dissent of people who would normally participate in peaceful protests. But now they will be scared to because of these harsh criminal penalties that they will be wrapped up in. Someone had asked specifically about, well, how does it affect peaceful protesters? And I think that's what's really important, because the bill defines committing a riot as anybody who participates in a protest that then turns violent through no fault of their own. So somebody could go to a protest, peacefully protesting. I could go with my family down to a protest. We could have no intent to engage in any disorderly conduct whatsoever, and we could just be holding some signs. But somewhere else, somebody could engage in a violent or disorderly act. And under this bill, because I'm participating in that peaceful protest that someone else has committed a violent or disorderly act, I could be arrested. And that's why this bill wraps up peaceful protesters. We already have laws on the books that make it a crime to commit a riot. What this bill does is it makes it a crime for a peaceful protester to attend a protest. Thank you.
Thanks, Kara. Yeah, it definitely is so disturbing, because it doesn't matter who you are, you get wrapped into it no matter what. Kirk, I want to ask you one of the questions from the audience. You talked before about the governor's bill that would restrict mail-in voting. Can you tell us a little bit about what the ACLU's plan for fighting that bill is? Well, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to note that that bill has not yet been introduced, so there's no bill number to it. And I think there was a question about that. There is a related bill, Senate Bill 90, that relates to vote by mail, but it's much more limited. The governor's proposal addresses ballot collection and some other ballot integrity issues, a couple of which I mentioned, but also some things that I didn't have the opportunity to mention. But in both cases, whether it's the governor's bill or Senate Bill 90, we will be actively opposing it through our own direct work, lobbying in the Capitol itself, sponsoring calls to action on our web page or via email or on our social media sites. All of our voting rights partners, including the League of Women Voters and a whole host of others, the NAACP, there's a long list, will also be doing the same thing. And the other thing I think I want to emphasize is that there are opposition by other public officials, whether they're local county commissioners or local supervisors of elections, who don't believe that this particular bill is the right thing to do in terms of administration of our elections and voting. And our understanding is they're going to be opposing it as well. So I think there's going to be a widespread effort to stop this bill or to change it in a way that would be acceptable. And I think that the Florida legislature has been responsive to those efforts in the past when it has come to voting issues. And I think we do have some confidence that this is a bill that we'll be able to either stop or significantly amend to make it tolerable.
Great. Thank you so much, Kirk. And Kara, can you just tell folks the bill number for the 20-week abortion ban? We had a question about that.
Yeah, sure. That's HB 351 and SB 744.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, I think that wraps up our audience questions for the evening. I want to thank the audience members who submitted those questions, but I also want to really say thank you to our fantastic guests, Pamela Birch-Ford, Kirk Bailey, and Kara Gross. We thank you for being with us this evening, but more importantly, we thank you all for being amazing, brave champions for change in this state. Now, we always end an episode of We Make the Way by inviting you to take action on a critical issue facing Florida. We do that because we know that when we work together, when we make our voices heard, we can create change in this state. And tonight, we want to invite you to take action to defend voting rights. As you've heard a couple times this evening already, Governor DeSantis has called on the legislature to make some sweeping changes to elections in Florida. He's called for them to make it much, much harder to vote by mail and to make it harder for every vote to count. The governor is proposing changes that don't just make it more difficult for elections to be administered in Florida. They make it harder for people to participate in our democracy. Now, of course, that's consistent with Governor DeSantis's long-standing opposition to the idea that the vote is a right at all. He's on record calling voting a privilege. Still, the governor's calling for these changes in the most disingenuous way possible, by claiming that they're necessary to protect the security of our elections. Now, considering the governor himself claimed just a few weeks ago that Florida is the nation's gold standard in safe, secure elections, it's pretty rich that he now insists that these changes are necessary. So we should be clear about what this is: just another front in the war on voting and in the assault on democracy itself. Now, at the ACLU, we believe that our democracy is strongest when as many eligible people participate as possible. Democracy is about saying that everyone matters and that everyone is included in the community. But this proposal does the opposite of that. And so we would ask you to take action on it. To the question before about what we're doing to fight this bill, a big part of it comes from you taking action, from being part of this fight. You can find more information on this proposal and how to contact your legislators directly by going to our website. We have a detailed legislative information page there that'll connect you directly with your state legislators. And what we need you to do is to let your legislator know that you support voting rights, that you support democracy, that you support keeping mail-in voting, something that Florida pioneered and has been wildly successful at, and that you want mail-in voting to be accessible. You need to let your legislators know that so that we can try and keep a vibrant democracy in this state. That's what we would ask you to do this legislative session. I hope that you've enjoyed this evening's conversation. As you heard, it promises to be a rip-roaring ride in the legislature this year. We're definitely going to have our guests back later this year to tell us after the fact what happened, who did it, and why. But in the meantime, we thank you for being with us this evening. That wraps up We Make the Way for this evening. I'm Micah Kubik. And on behalf of all of us at the ACLU of Florida, I want to say thank you again to our panelists. Thank you all for being with us. Until next time, keep making the way for freedom, for justice, and for democracy. Good night.